The latter half of the 19th century in America was dominated by rail. It wasn't just the time of the rail barons, it was a time of great economic and population growth and migration. Up to 1870, the nation boasted some 45,000 miles of track. By 1900, we would add 170,000 more. Rails brought people, and rails brought money. Your city's main station was the first thing that people saw. It represented your city, its wealth, its importance, its ambition. And perhaps no single station represented the fortunes of a city more than Detroit's Michigan Central Station, ironically, in a city known for building one of railroad's great competitors, the automobile. The grand story of Michigan Central Station is the story of a city, of a nation, and of history almost lost. History that deserves to be remembered. Detroit was initially built as a fort and trading post by the French in 1701. The early history of Detroit is the subject of another episode of The History Guy. But from the beginning, its location on the Great Lakes made it a natural center for trade. That fact was recognized fairly early in American history. In 1810, the entire population of the territory of Michigan, which had been organized in 1805, was less than 5,000. By 1830, it was some 30,000. While the population of Detroit was only around 2,200 of those, its potential showed when in 1831, the Detroit and St. Joseph Railroad was incorporated, with the goal of creating a line from Detroit across the Michigan Peninsula to the town of St. Joseph, where freight could be taken by boat to Chicago. It was very forward thinking. Chicago at the time had a population of only around 250. But even then, it was obvious that the two towns were well located to facilitate trade and industry, not just to the rapidly growing Midwestern territories, but also with Canada and to the Mississippi River. The Detroit and St. Joseph Railroad struggled and faced bankruptcy multiple times, but it represented a belief in the city whose population would grow fourfold over the next decade. Eventually incorporated as the Michigan Central Railroad in 1846, it would represent the rising fortunes of Detroit for another century. The city's fortunes continued to expand. Immigration was important. Notably, a large Irish diaspora started settling in the city as early as the 1830s, followed by Germans and Greeks. Immigrants often found less anti immigrant sentiment the farther west they went. Later, Scandinavian immigrants were drawn to the state to mine iron ore in the northern part of the state, and many settled in Detroit to become toolmakers. They would be followed by waves of Italian and Polish immigrants. By 1845, the population of the city was over 13,000. About the same time, the Michigan Central finally reached the shores of Lake Michigan, although, unfortunately for St. Joseph, by then the route had changed, with the rail going farther south to New Buffalo. The Michigan Central had, by then, decided to extend all the way to Chicago. It was not the only railroad to connect to the city. The Detroit and Pontiac line had been the second railroad in Michigan to operate trains in 1838, and more were to come. The Detroit, Monroe, and Toledo opened in 1856. Detroit's location was now a center of trade, connecting the Midwest to both the Mississippi and the Erie Canal. That showed in the Michigan Central Depot on the southwest corner of 3rd and West Jefferson Avenue, today the location of Joe Louis Arena. Completed in 1848, the Detroit Historical Society described the building. The depot is classically influenced, with a two-story gabled structure with Greek pediments and pilaster facings on the front. A massive dome in the rear, which made a striking impact from the river, was a train shed, grain elevator, baggage room, and storage warehouse. The adjacent yards had approximately 800 feet of river frontage. A wide wharf lay adjacent, where vessels transferred cargo from the elevator and a warehouse. It was an impressive symbol of the city. The Detroit News reports that in the 1850s, the Michigan Central Depot was one of the largest in the country. 100 feet wide and 800 feet long, with a waterfront of nearly 1,900 feet, a wharf of 40 feet wide, a circular engine house, and two storehouses. It was also a center of commerce and growth. In 1875, the railroad carried 862,416 passengers and 1.7 million tons of freight. The station would serve during a period that the Detroit Historical Society described as Boomtown Detroit. The city's population was over 20,000 by 1850 and doubled again before 1860. By 1870, it was nearly 80,000 and over 100,000 by 1880, and the depot was simply not large enough. In 1876, the Michigan Central was purchased by the New York Central Railroad, putting it under the ownership of Cornelius Vanderbilt, at the time possibly the richest person in America. Whether you call him a railroad tycoon or a robber baron, one of the things that he understood was the importance of prestige of a railway station. In 1871, he ordered the construction of New York's magnificent Grand Central Depot on 42nd Street. In 1882, it was Detroit's turn. Newspapers across Michigan reported that Vanderbilt had approved a new passenger station for the Michigan Central that was to be 200 feet by 600 feet of brick with stone trimmings and iron sheds, at the predicted cost of $200,000. The station was designed by and constructed under the supervision of famed New York architect Cyrus L.W. Eidlitz. HistoricDetroit.org explains numerous turrets made it look like a medieval castle, and the waiting rooms — there was a separate waiting room for ladies — had marble floors. Its massive clock towered above everything around it. The brick and stone structure was the point of arrival and departure for all trains of the New York Central lines and connected with the Canadian Division by ferry and tunnel. The thriving railroad added vastly to its waterfront shed space and tracks to serve a growing Detroit. The interior featured marble and inlaid wooden floors, stained glass, black ash wainscoting, and a huge Queen Anne-style fireplace. Like the previous station, the Michigan Central Depot was the pride of the city and welcomed important visitors like New York Governor Theodore Roosevelt in 1900. The Michigan Central was still a subsidiary of the New York Central, and in 1903 leased a line from the Canadian Southern, providing the most direct route to New York. The city grew to nearly 500,000 people while it was served by the depot. But 30 years on, it was clear that the city had outgrown the depot. The station was on a spur line, which was inconvenient for the growing number of passengers coming through. Moreover, Michigan Central had undergone a grand project. Although Windsor, Ontario was less than 2 miles from Detroit, the Detroit River was in between. Prior to 1910, New York and Michigan Central trains traveling to and from Canada had to use railway ferries. But between 1906 and 1910, under the direction of New York Central engineer William Wilgus, the railroad constructed the 1.6-mile-long Michigan Central Railway Tunnel under the Detroit River. Not only was the volume of trains and people becoming too much for the station at 3rd and West Jefferson, but the railroad wanted a station closer to the opening to the tunnel. In fact, the railroad had already been buying up land in the area before the tunnel was finished. Historic Detroit writes, by spring 1910, about 50 acres of property for the depot had been acquired, with about 300 small wooden frame homes being bought or condemned. Matthew Scanlon, the real estate dealer who acquired the land for the railroad, had to call on one old woman 40 times to get her to sell. It was said to be the largest real estate transaction ever in the state at the time. It was to be an extraordinary building. Historic Detroit explains, the idea was part of the City Beautiful movement of the time, which called for grand public buildings at the end of dramatic vistas. New York had already faced the issue. The station that had once been the pride of the city had become overcrowded, despite upgrades. In 1899, the New York Times had complained, nothing except the New York City government has been so discreditable to it as its principal railroad station at 42nd Street. In 1903, the entire station was replaced, largely under the supervision of Wilgus. The new building, the Grand Central Terminal, was to be the biggest in the world. Co-designed by the firms Reed and Starin and Warren and Wetmore, the famous terminal, and don't call it a station, was built in the Beaux Arts style, which was so popular for public buildings at the time. The Chicago Architecture Center explains, influenced by classical Roman and Greek forms, Beaux Arts emerged as the dominant style of architecture in the United States between the late 19th century and early 20th century. Grand Central Terminal is still today among the most famous in the world, but it says much about the importance of Detroit. Wilgus was by then vice president of the Central Michigan, that the new station there, construction started before Grand Central was completed, would be designed in the same style, by the same architects. They designed a station, Historic Detroit explains, fitting for the growing city it served. Building permits were issued in 1910, and the building was scheduled to open in January of 1914. The station alone cost the mind-boggling sum of $2.5 million, but the total project with the office tower and tunnel cost more than $16 million. It was a project of enormous size. Historic Detroit explains. It's made of more than 8 million bricks, 125,000 cubic feet of stone, and 7,000 tons of structural steel, plus another 4,000 tons in the sheds. The foundation has 20,000 cubic yards of concrete. The 3-story depot was connected to an 18-story office tower. This made the new station, at 232 feet, the tallest train station in the world. Once again, the Michigan Central Station was the pride of the city. The Detroit Free Press writes, the new Michigan Central Station is one of the finest structures of its type in the country and contains every convenience for the traveler. The main waiting room is a magnificent room, 97 feet wide and 220 feet long, with arched ceilings 63 feet or 4 full stories above the floor. Besides the waiting room and the concourse on the main floor, there's a reading room for men, 40 by 50 feet in dimension, and a tea room, 24 feet by 50 feet at the west end of the waiting room. The restaurant, lunchroom, barber shop, and drugstore are on the main floor of the waiting room. As for the station, the press reported that there are 11 tracks for use of the passenger trains, and the longest of these will hold a train of 18 Pullman cars under cover. In perhaps a symbol of the change, the station had to open early. On December 26, 1913, a fire started in the records room of the old station. Historic Detroit writes, flames, which firefighters could not get under control, raged from 2 to 4 p.m. Rafters supporting the slate roof burned away, causing the roof to cave in. The new station was pressed into service a few weeks earlier than expected and was taking trains just hours after the fire. If it was a sign of the city moving on, it was a portent as well. The old building was burned, but not torn down, becoming, as Historic Detroit explains, decrepit and an eyesore until the railroad finally came through with funds to have it torn down in 1966. The new building, one of the finest in the country, would see Detroit through a golden age. The automotive industry grew in the city owing to its strategic location, industrial base, and access to labor. In 1914, Henry Ford offers his famous $5 a day wage, a watershed event for U.S. labor that was key to the growing American middle class. The opportunity offered by Detroit's growing manufacturing brought more than 1.2 million new citizens to the city between 1910 and 1940. More than 100,000 of those were black Americans migrating north as part of the Great Migration. Ford's life-changing wage was offered regardless of race, making Detroit a center of the migration that was transforming the nation. Between 1910 and 1920 alone, the city's black population grew 600%, spurring a renaissance of arts and culture that would, among other things, transform the nation's culture with the creation of Motown. Many of these new Detroiters were welcomed to the city at Michigan Central Station, which in 1916 hosted more than 200 trains a day. More came with the manufacturing booms of both the Great War and the Second World War. In the 1940s, more than 4,000 people passed through the station every day, with another 3,000 working in the office tower. Detroit and Michigan Central Station thrived into the 1960s. Michigan Public Radio reported in 2018, even into the 1960s, it was an impressive sight. John Kawagoma, a local resident, recalled, "I remember all that. You know, the large marble pillars and all the brasswork. The old guy that had the shoe shine stand." There are many reasons for the station's decline. Trains were replaced by cars and planes. The station was not built to accommodate cars or parking, isolating it from an increasingly automobile-centric population. New York Central tried to sell the station in 1956 for a third of what they had paid to build it, but found no takers. By 1967, most of the amenities were shut down, with just a couple of ticket counters handling the dwindling number of rail customers. Detroit Public Radio reported it was showing its age, and the Passenger Rail Corporation put a few millions into renovations, but it wasn't enough. Ticket revenue just couldn't keep up with the nation's expensive needs. In 1988, Amtrak moved out, setting up at a much smaller, cheaper building downtown. The station passed through a succession of owners, all failing to find a viable use for it. One by one, the most valuable and irreplaceable items were sold. The chandeliers, the lighting, the brass fixtures. Scrappers broke in and stole what was left. Both metaphorically and literally, the train had left the station. And in many ways, this was representative of the city. Once the fifth largest city in America, the population of Detroit peaked in 1957 and began a long decline. The once dominant auto industry declined in the face of global competition and was further impacted by automation and outsourcing. Auto manufacturers moved, and the percent of the nation's auto manufacturing jobs in Detroit fell from 56% in 1950 to 40% in 1960. A shift to the suburbs, white flight, deprived the city of tax revenues. Racial tensions flared, crime rose, public services faltered. The city, like the station, became a model of what came to be called urban decay. It seems, as went Michigan Central Station, so went Detroit. Although declared a National Historic Landmark in 1975, the building fell into near ruin. Its fixtures gone, many of the Beaux Arts decorations that had adorned its interiors broken, its sub-basement a frozen lake, its pillars and wall covered with graffiti. Michigan Central University writes, it had fallen into such ruin that bats were living in the basement. Plan after plan fell through in the face of huge costs of renovation and the lack of a good vision for its future use. In 2009, the city council voted to have the decaying building demolished. It was saved because of its historic status, but plans continued to fall through. But in 2018, Ford Motor Company, which had played such a role in Detroit history, acquired the station, with, according to a company press release, plans to transform it into the centerpiece of a vibrant new campus in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood that will serve as an innovation hub for Ford's vision for the future of transportation. Those plans, Michigan Public Radio opined, seemed much more firm than many of the pie-in-the-sky visions floated by other developers. The restoration, estimated to have cost some $940 million, required approximately 1.7 million hours of work from more than 3,000 tradespeople, required the reinstallment of 29,000 Gustavino tiles. The independent news website The Conversation noted that a stonemason spent 428 hours hand carving a capital column from a 21,000-pound limestone block supplied by an obsolete quarry in Indiana, which had been resurrected solely for the purpose of the station's restoration. Michigan Central Station was reopened to the public with a concert in June of 2024, the first time the public had been let inside since the station closed in 1988. You can hardly blame the people of Detroit for seeing it as a sign. In the previous year, the population of Detroit had increased by 1,852, the first time that the population had gone up rather than down since 1957. I had the chance to visit last week. It is a beautiful building that sings with history that deserves to be remembered. It's a bridge between the past and the future, and a reminder of how close history can come to being lost. Since 1848, Michigan Central Station has represented the city of Detroit, but more than that, it represents America and its growth in a time when rail led the way. Railway stations facilitated the movement of people, of commerce, of information, but more than that, they represented how your city wanted to be perceived. Its art, its architecture, a social gathering place, and a civic model that a modern airport can never match. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.